Hello, so today I'm joined with a somewhat legendary figure within the Anglo-Jewish community, Harry Markham. So Harry, please introduce yourself to my audience.
Hi guys, I'm Harry. Thank you ever so much, Norman, for inviting me. I am a research fellow, a junior research fellow, in fact, at the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. I'm the head of research and policy at the oldest British Muslim organisation, the Association of British Muslims. I'm an advisory board member at Academics for Academic Freedom. I'm also a student, an undergraduate student at UCL, and I'm a nice Jewish boy.
So before we get into the details of your research and your hopefully forthcoming book, can you tell us a bit about how the events since October the 7th have personally affected you?
Oh, well, I think like most others in our community, I've been a combination of shocked, heartbroken, and just really, I'm not sure quite how to articulate these feelings. It's been awful. We need to understand the gut-wrenching events beyond the Middle East. We need to understand that this is a global insurgency against Jews and against civilization. And I think, and I'm sure we'll come on to this soon, but what we are seeing on the streets of Western Europe and around the world, in my view, is symptomatic of issues that for a long time successive governments have ignored and not dealt with. And I've argued previously that governments have been negligent in the same degree that they have been delusional in trying to engineer a diverse utopia. But I think in addition to governmental negligence, we are now seeing, and the events since October the 7th have really brought this out, we are now seeing not state-sanctioned anti-Semitism, but state-enabled anti-Semitism. And the implications of anti-Semitism go well beyond Jews. This is a crisis of both of and for civilization, and we ignore it at our own peril.
Have you been out and about in London and seen any of the demonstrations or experienced any hostility yourself?
Oh yeah, I mean, I try to avoid London as much as possible recently, but unfortunately, because of various things, I have to go to university, and I'm often commuting in and around London, so it's hard to avoid. And look, I've been experiencing this for many years, and as someone who has spoken out for Israel, you know, I'm used to the insults, the anger, the aggression. It's a part of the job, as it were. But that said, what we are seeing now is of a different breed. It's no longer just a case of there being anti-Semitism, but a kind of unadulterated evil has unleashed itself across Western Europe and around the world. And I've not seen something like this before. October the 7th didn't initiate this, but certainly the events since October 7th have brought this to the surface. And I have to say, I think people are beginning to realise that the issues for so long that have been ignored, this is the result of this failure to deal with these issues.
And at UCL in particular, what's the atmosphere like there?
Well, you see, ordinarily on campus I wear a big Star of David, and I wear it visibly, and I also have on my laptop a huge sticker with the words F anti-Semitism, and I sit in front of students and I hear them gossiping about me, which is always a laugh. But UCL, no, there is an atmosphere on campus, a very worrying and disturbing atmosphere. The truth is that students in my university and beyond Jewish students, that is, are feeling scared. Doubtless there are students who are not coming onto campus because of this. Students who would ordinarily wear a kippah or display other sort of religious symbols are not doing so. Because unfortunately there are students on campus, and although relative to the student population they may be few in number, they are a sizable minority and they are concerning. And unfortunately, their work doesn't just serve to intimidate Jews, but it's become a kind of anti-intellectualism we see amongst these students. One of the things that really bothers me is the denial of what happened on October the 7th. The denial, the distortion of incontrovertible truths recorded by Hamas themselves, I should add, and the way in which students have been denying it or distorting it or questioning it. It's reminiscent of the kind of Nick Griffin-like Holocaust denial that your generation witnessed. This is a form of neo-Holocaust denial. And interestingly, I should just say, on the question of the far right, it's become apparent that people are trying to label people who stand by Jews as all being far right. But I should just say that as someone who studies the manifestations of contemporary anti-Semitism, that the real frightening, scary hard right are certainly not standing by Jews right now. And you only need to see Nick Griffin's Twitter page and others like him to see how what we are seeing now is the formation of unholy anti-democratic alliances, which brings the far right together with the far left and with Islamists, and they form a coalition of not only Jew hate but anti-democratic extremism, and Jew hate just happens to be the common denominator. So I think that's really important to remember.
Okay, well, later on I want to take you up on explore this point about what is classified as the far right, because of course my view is that term has been severely misused within the freedom movement and elsewhere, but we'll come on to that.
Yeah.
Tell us more about the research you do and who you work with.
So, okay, I've just completed a book tentatively entitled The Delusion of Multiculturalism, with a foreword written by my good friend and colleague Sheikh Paul Armstrong, the managing director of the Association of British Muslims. My research looks at Western European multiculturalism, and I argue that multiculturalism has endangered both Jews and civilization. And I argue that unless we have a radical cultural, social, political reckoning with the ideals which have led us to the place where we are now, Western Europe is heading in a very dark direction. And Jews, often in the history of civilizational crises, are the first to fall, but they are by no means the last. And I will just use a kind of very sweet analogy, if I may. But it was said my grandfather was a taxi driver. I think you even drew a picture of his taxi once.
Yeah.
But it was said of the cab trade that you could measure how well an economy was doing by how well the cabbies were doing. In other words, if the cabbies were doing well, so was the economy. Well, in a similar way, you can measure how well a society is doing by the way its Jews are treated. And if its Jews are in trouble, we're all in trouble. So I'm looking at contemporary anti-Semitism. I'm looking at how contemporary anti-Semitism, which was once something which we saw predominantly amongst the right, has now, we are seeing, though that far-right anti-Semitism still exists, when it comes to Islamist anti-Semitism, it pales into insignificance. And the data on this is striking.
And what about leftist anti-Semitism?
Well, leftist anti-Semitism, absolutely. And what we know is that leftist anti-Semitism both contributes and enables other forms of anti-Semitism, especially Islamist anti-Semitism. Actually, if we look at the way in which recent events have played out, we can see that in the name of progressivism and so-called liberation, how Palestinianism, which is something separate from a legitimate cause for Palestinian nationhood, which is a separate conversation, but Palestinianism, which we are seeing across Western Europe, which has nothing to do with the rights of Palestinians, but the destruction of Israel, how that has been enabled in the name of progressivism. One of the things that I've just been struck by over the past few weeks, and I say struck because although I have been aware of this for a long time, in the face of such evil, the way in which leftist circles have been justifying this in the name of legitimate armed resistance, as if the mutilation of babies, the raping women, the burning of bodies is somehow constitutes legitimate armed resistance. And it's that kind of unspeakable breakdown of any semblance of moral decency that I think enables the violence, the threats, the intimidation we are seeing across the world at the moment against Jews. But no, my research looks at that, but it also looks at how we have got here.
Just on that point,
yeah,
this is an important point again, because the three factions of anti-Semitism, you talk about the far right, the far left, and the Islamists, right? Do you think it's fair to say that, in contrast to the far right, which actually, fortunately, has no kind of like political or media power whatsoever, they are genuinely ostracised by mainstream society, the far left and the Islamists have actually significant media power and influence, as well as, of course, the fact that there are many Islamist countries. And the far left has major seats of control, of course, everywhere in the world and in the media. So I'm wondering if the temptation has always been to say anti-Semitism is coming from the far right, because those who actually genuinely have the power to enable and basically produce anti-Semitism to the masses are able to use the far right as a convenient scapegoat.
Oh, it's extraordinary. I mean, one of the great examples I often speak of is in Germany, and the German authority responsible for recording anti-Semitism, its name evades me, but when they are unable to identify the background of an offender or someone who has committed an act of anti-Semitism, they immediately label that person to be far right. Well, we know from the data that actually, although there is a worrying rise in actual far right neo-Nazism in Germany, although nothing that's sort of overwhelming the German state, compared to Islamist anti-Semitism in Germany, it's virtually non-existent. Or at least not as worrying as Islamist anti-Semitism in terms of... So there is a part of... And this is I use the term anti-Semitism distortion. Because I think that what's happening across Western Europe is that state services do not have the adequate facilities in place to actually research what is happening with regards to anti-Semitism, and specifically what strains of anti-Semitism are most concerning. It's all well-intentioned to say we want to rid our societies of anti-Semitism. We won't. It's a hatred which has existed for millennia. But we can manage its most difficult or its most threatening expressions. And unfortunately, its most threatening and dangerous expression is its Islamist expression. And Western European governments, and I say Western Europe because that's my area of research, has no real grip on the issue. It has no real understanding of the extent to which that anti-Semitism exists, the way in which this term non-violent violence, the way in which the ideas of murderous anti-Semitism have been normalised in large sections of our Muslim communities. The failure to recognise that means that there can be no real credible governmental response. And one of the things that's really interesting now is that governments just don't know what to do. Governments do not know how to adequately respond to what's happening. And that's for a very good reason, because for so long they have not dealt with the underlying issues at play. My book, really, I suppose, is the road to October 7th.
Yes, of course, because you completed the manuscript.
Yeah, and actually that was the name of the... Yeah, and actually I wrote an afterword with that title, so yeah.
I want to go more into the book in a minute, but again, tell me a little bit more again about the organisation.
So I two organisations. So the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. So I look at, again, my area is Western Europe. So I look at anti-Semitism in Western Europe, and I look at the efficacy, what a word, of Western European governments in managing anti-Semitism. And my words are not so kind towards our governments in Western Europe. But my other role is at the Association of British Muslims.
Tell me about this organisation.
So we are as I said, the oldest British Muslim organisation, and our purpose is to reclaim the centre ground. I'm proudly on the centre. Of
course, people would say at this point, well, you as a Zionist Jew, what have you got to, why should you be a voice for a Muslim organisation?
Well, I'm not a voice for them, I'm supporting them, because really governments have, at least seemingly, have been more supportive towards organisations which have affiliations with extremist organisations, rather than organisations which are trying to reconcile faith with liberal democratic values, and with people that see no contradiction in being a proud Muslim and also believing in liberal democratic values. And I have to say, the bravest people I have met are people that work with and are connected to my organisation in terms of speaking out against Islamism. Interestingly, I will just say that the Jewish organisations who I've tried to work with do not want to talk about this issue. That is senior Jewish leadership organisations.
Yes.
The people who, and the organisations which have been most active in dealing with these issues are the likes of the Association of British Muslims, Muslims Against Anti-Semitism, some certain Hindu organisations. It's just sad that I describe anti-Semitism as a psychosis, and part of the pathology of that psychosis, as with many other psychoses, is to deny reality. It's delusional. It's and I see that, and that doesn't just affect anti-Semites, it also affects the victims of anti-Semitism. They deny the reality. It's this Voldemort effect, if you will.
Yeah, so on that point, because you mentioned about, you implied something therefore about what I call the establishment Jews, as represented by organisations like the Board of Deputies of British Jews, the Jewish Leadership Council, and even sort of the Jewish newspapers, like the Jewish Chronicle and Jewish News. These are clearly dominated by left-leaning progressives who, it seems to me, have for many years indeed been in the kind of denial that you're talking about of where the real anti-Semitism comes from. They've actually cozied up to the more extreme Islamic organisations that you're talking about. Presumably they've never had any formal dealings with your...
I'm not aware. They may have done. I don't know.
But they've certainly had plenty of dealings with organisations closely linked to the Muslim Brotherhood and politicians linked to that. Again, comes back to this classification of what the different types of anti-Semitism are. Their almost entire focus has been, well, it's the far right. And they've completely ignored, they've been in complete denial about the far left, because many of those share the same, progressive woke ideas of the far left, because that's where they come from. Right. That's where those individuals come from. And certainly they're not at all representative of real British Jewry, even though there's a perception that they are. And they've been in complete denial about the Islamist threat of anti-Semitism.
Well, they have, and again, the term I use is the Voldemort effect, because in Harry Potter, of course, not only did people deny that Voldemort was back, they refused to give Voldemort a name.
Right.
They would not. They would say they would not name him because the threat of him was so overwhelming that they would name him. But the problem is, if you can't even name an issue, you have no hope of dealing with an issue. And I think, unfortunately, that effect, that Voldemort effect, has become endemic within these institutions.
But then onto your own personal experiences, because as I understand it, because you have been speaking out in this way, you've actually been essentially ostracised from what I call the establishment Jewish community.
Look, they for a long time I have anyway. I don't really care. But it's a tragedy because I'm not the person that they portray me to be. I'm someone that cares about the preservation of liberal democracy, and I care about countering extremism, and I care about creating a society in which there is genuine tolerance. And to that end, I call out intolerance from sources which they deny have any intolerance, right? So I'm absolutely committed to the values of liberal democracy and to the values which they at least proclaim to champion. But yeah, I have been ostracised. I've had people rage against me on Twitter or X now. I've went to speak at different places and that's been called off. I mean, it's tough.
They regard you as an extremist and someone who they don't want to be seen associated with and speaking on behalf of the Jews.
Well, if only the certain people within those organisations which are responsible for trying to counsel me would care as much about the Islamist threat as they do about me, then maybe we'd have some hope of changing the situation on the ground.
Well, exactly. I mean, they classify you presumably as far right, don't they? That's basically what it boils down to.
Yeah, and I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. But
it's the same that this is not just Jewish people they ostracise and demonise in this way. I mean, they did exactly the same with people like, to be fair, Tommy Robinson and Katie Hopkins, who were very strong advocates for Israel and friends of the Jewish people, but they just classify them as far right, and they seek to demonise and censor them.
Look, I think there are lots of people out there who have unpalatable opinions, right? And we don't have to agree with everyone, but it's so cheap and easy to label everyone you disagree with as far right. And I'll say this, that part of my work is to reclaim these issues from populism. I want to see centrist parties and even left-leaning parties deal with the issues that the likes of Tommy Robinson address. Rather than labelling Tommy Robinson and his supporters as far right, actually I think we have a responsibility as responsible society to engage with the issues he has addressed. Because actually, Tommy Robinson, though he may not be posh or to the liking of certain Hampstead elites, he does address issues which need addressing. And in my view, we need to take those issues on as responsible centrists. And that's what I'm trying to encourage.
Okay, but even the posh kind of like versions of Tommy Robinson, say someone like Douglas Murray, who essentially says exactly the same things as Tommy Robinson, but in a very posh accent with a much more extensive vocabulary.
Yes,
he's also been essentially ostracised from the establishment jury.
And I should think probably Melanie Phillips too. I think lots of people look. There is certainly an ideological war, so to speak, against people that dissent from the kind of orthodoxy of trying to hold the line of multiculturalism is a kind of civic religion and
the establishment jury is committed to that religion of multiculturalism, and therefore would it be fair to say that they are not without blame for the situation that you have described that we are now in?
I think, and I'm not trying to compare today with 1933 because I'm not a fan of kind of historical comparisons in that way, but I will just say in 1933, when Hitler came to power, the largest Jewish organisation in Germany at the time, the Liberal Jewish Union, I think it was called, I can't remember the name exactly, issued a statement in which they basically said that for Jews who are worrying and planning to leave Germany now, they were never truly German in the first place. Huh. And I think that these conversations are not easy. The conversations I am trying to promote, they are not easy, they are difficult, and they involve us really reconsidering the relationships and company we keep. But they are important, and Jewish organisations, so long as they do not deal with these organisations, I'm afraid to say, not only are they negligent because they abandon.
So when you say not dealing with which organisations like yours,
as the establishment, as you put it, do not deal with the issues that I have laid out.
Deal with the issues, okay,
right? Yeah,
okay.
I think not only are they negligent because they have a responsibility to protect their, as it were, flock, but to some extent they are also complicit, and I don't say that lightly. I think organisations have a responsibility, Jewish organisations have a responsibility to speak out on these issues and to call it out where they see it and not leave it to a few individuals here and there. My friends at Charlie Hebdo, and I have a friend there rather, and he tells me when he goes into his office, it's like walking into a bunker. There are armed guards everywhere. It's terrifying. The fact is, there are brave individuals here and there, but they've been abandoned. Mm. And if you abandon people that are working for change, good people that are working for change, what happens? Those people not only face threats, violence, and potential death, but the issues themselves it's so easy to dismiss these issues as being a kind of far-right bandwagon. And that to me is where we are at now. Because organisations which do have the capacity to speak on these issues and bring them to public attention have not done so. And they've left it to a few brave individuals, be that certain journalists, be that individual Muslim voices or individual Hindu voices or individual Christian voices or even individual Jewish voices. They have been abandoned. And what these organisations don't seem to realise is the more you leave these issues in what Ayaan Hirsi Ali describes as the taboo zone, and the more you leave issues of this kind in a taboo zone, well, what happens? The likes of Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders and the AfD deal with these issues and talk about these issues. And what's interesting is that the same establishment...
But do you have a real problem with those people?
No. What I'm saying is that look, the establishment talk about we need to stop the likes of Le Pen, Wilders, etc. But by dismissing these issues as far right and not grappling with these issues and not dealing with them, they actually lend credence to the far right. That's my point. They actually, I'm not saying they're far right, but I'm saying they lend credence at least to what we can say they're populist right. They inadvertently give those organisations, they further their momentum. And I'm saying if you want to take the debate away from them, you have to reclaim these conversations. On the question of Le Pen, etc., and Wilders and the AfD and such like, I'll say this. I want to see centrism take these issues on. Unfortunately, they haven't done so. And what is extraordinary at the moment is that organisations or parties which were once involved in Holocaust denial and even have some connections to fascism historically, have now become, I would say, our last hope. For Jews at least. And what a sad indictment that is on the state of liberal democracy, that we have to entrust our futures in the hands of people which may themselves be democratic, but may have elements within their parties which have illiberal tendencies.
But Wilders and AfD in particular, of course, if you look at their policies, these are nationalist organisations. They believe in the nation state and the strong nation state. I mean, that gets them classified as far right, of course, right? And the only other thing that gets them classified as far right is that they do take the same strong stance that you have against the Islamist threat. That is the key to them being called far right. One of the best proponents in the freedom movement over the last 3 years, truly liberal voice, has been Christine Anderson of the AfD in Germany.
Right. Yeah.
Now, what is far right about her?
I think that, firstly, I don't believe that those parties are institutionally far right. Now, there might be individuals within them that may be far right. I don't know everything about those parties, but I do not believe institutionally they are far right. There are far right parties out there, and by the way, it should be said the far right hate the likes of Marine Le Pen.
Exactly,
and Wilders and such like. Why? Because they see they're in bed with Jews.
Exactly.
Someone truly on the far right, and I say this as someone who really studies the far right and writes about it, they under no circumstances will get into bed with Jews. Ever. Yeah. Much less Zionists. But on that, I would say that it's very easy to label parties which are talking about Islamism as far right. I think it's very much an Anglo thing too. I think the British conservative is very much a small c conservative, very quiet. There's a lot of decorum. Well, I don't. I'm rather loud. But most British conservatives wouldn't behave like the conservatives on the continent. And we need to understand that our perception of what is a kind of conservative voice is very much grounded in our British experience. That said, it's to me, as someone who, I have many kind of economic ideals which are left-leaning. That's why I belong to the I previously belonged to the SDP, the Social Democratic Party, a very fringe party, but left-leaning economically, but more right-leaning culturally. I'll say that the people that are so readily prepared to label those parties as far right do not seem to understand that although those parties may not say things they like, actually the policies, just on a policy front, what they are addressing has profound implications for the welfare of not only democracy, but cohesion, the economy, security within a society. These are legitimate issues, and it's so cheap and so easy to label those people far right, and it's frankly lazy. It's lazy because the issues that are being addressed matter, and what to me is astonishing is that even though Jeremy Corbyn, when he was running for Prime Minister for the second time in 2019, offered economic policies which I suppose were more friendly towards the Red Wall seats in the north, many of those seats turned blue. Why? Because the Conservative Party was addressing the very real cultural and social grievances of those people. And I'm baffled as to why the left today continue to ignore those issues, continue to make no real commitment to dealing with immigration or cohesion and such like. Rather, what they do is they just dismiss the Conservative mantra of stopping the small boats, which is just, in my words, meaningless, in my view, just meaningless words. But I think that the truth is the Labour Party are angry because they have no real alternative. They have no real credible policy in place to manage the issues which Red Wall constituents are concerned with.
But hang on, isn't interesting enough, of course, the Conservatives after the election and then, of course, abandoned the principles that those Red Wall
there's nothing conservative about the Conservative Party.
But isn't it the case that the problem with the Labour Party is that they are dependent on a significant proportion of their core vote is now the Muslim and Islamist vote.
So, look, and this is a point that I think you and I have discussed on several occasions before, and I dedicated a whole section in my third chapter to this, and I describe it as the politics of numbers. David Baddiel said Jews don't count. Well, it's also the case that people don't need to count Jews, because we are very small in number. So when it comes to the issue of the Israeli-Arab contestation, one of the interesting things about it, and I have to, in some sense, admire Keir Starmer, rare thing though that is, because he has maintained a position which is not politically opportunistic.
Only since October the 7th, not before.
Right, okay, fine. I accept that. And he could well pay the price. I think that the likes of Galloway, for example, George Galloway, could well seize this opportunity. I was... yesterday, I'm not sure if you saw, but in Bethnal Green and Bow, the MP, Rashana Ali, that's right, yeah, who was just Shadow Secretary of State, or Minister of State, I can't remember, but she followed Keir Starmer's...
Which was actually quite a surprise to me, but probably because of her Shadow Minister position.
She abstained. Well, she could have resigned, but she chose not to. Yeah. Now, it would be very interesting to see. Firstly, I think that she could be in actual danger physically. I think that was a very... I sincerely hope she is safe and...
They actually went to her...
Well, they went to her office.
Right, okay.
And I think that so I just...
A couple of thousand
I'm not sure.
Kids?
Well, that's today. A lot of school kids out today.
No, yesterday I saw it.
Really?
I
wasn't aware.
that.
Okay, that's interesting. But secondly, if the likes of George Galloway was the former MP for that constituency, interestingly enough, he could well seize this opportunity. The fact is, in 2001, the French socialist intellectual Pascal Boniface wrote a letter to the then François Hollande, and he said to him, you need to realise that in your country, in our country, France, there are 10 times more Muslims than Jews. And in that case, you need to adopt policies which are more friendly towards the Palestinian cause than Israel, because we need the Muslim vote. And Hollande ignored I'm not sure if it was Hollande, I can't remember, but certainly the Socialist Party at the time ignored that. Today, socialism in France under Jean-Luc Mélenchon, he has taken on Boniface's words. And what's incredible is that the national demonstration, I think, in which 180,000 people attended in Paris against anti-Semitism, the party which did not show its face was the Socialist Party. The party which did was Le Pen. And I think that particular example serves to illustrate the way in which the tables have turned politically.
Okay, so going back then to the book, is there anything more you want to say about what's in the book before we get onto the issue of the publication?
Well, I'll just say this, that I use anti-Semitism as a case study to gauge with the wider issues we are seeing with Western Europe and what I see as the delusions of liberal elites over the years. Anti-Semitism is always a good case study because, as I alluded to earlier, the relationship between Jews and civilization, they are inextricably linked. So if Jews are not doing well, civilization is in trouble, and I think that we are seeing that today. But yeah, I certainly will say that the implications go well beyond Jews. And what we saw on October the 7th, and this needs to be understood, is that it's not just a war against Jews. This is a war against civilization itself and all the values which we hold dear in our civilization, namely democracy, the right to be an individual, the right to believe what you please, the right to be free. And it's a war against that. And I am so outraged that people who are not even far left, but people who proclaim to champion the liberal cause, just my fellow centrists, do not seem to realise what is going on. And it's not, this kind of extremism is no longer just enabled by the far left. It's also enabled by people who we see as kind of reasonable.
Well, indeed. I mean, this is something that I've been talking about, is that people who I considered as close colleagues in the so-called freedom movement, or the Skeptics movement, call it what you like, but those who were fighting, challenging the sort of the COVID orthodoxy and the mandates, because they were basically wanted individual in the lockdowns. They wanted individual freedom, and they didn't want to be forced into lockdown. They didn't want to be forced to take vaccine, etc. Those people, so many of those, have somehow come out as not just anti-Israel in this case, but they are basically swallowing the Hamas propaganda about the whole issue. It's
and the same people say don't believe the media.
The people who say don't believe the media question everything. Actually still don't believe anything that the Israelis say, but they believe everything that that Hamas say, and everything that people like the BBC and the Guardian, who they ridiculed and never trusted before, suddenly are their trusted sources. Now, is this then about some latent anti-Semitism coming about, or is this the power of that entire propaganda machine which they've been subjected to over many years about the Israel-Palestine conflict?
I suspect it's both. I will say that look, when it comes to the issue of globalism and its discontents, and for someone who is concerned by the trajectory of globalism, it's very hard to talk about globalism now and criticise the way globalism is going without lending credence to people who have anti-Semitic views. Unfortunately, I will say that the, as it were, the freedom or skeptic movement does have a particular problem. It does, and it means that I want to see, and I think that what I know that what you're trying to do, and others too, who also share, we are addressing very legitimate issues about the behaviour of governments during lockdowns or the sort of decline of the nation state, the way in which we are becoming cashless and such, and so on. It's a nightmare going to Gales with you because we can't both pay cash. But
I always pick up the tab though.
Yeah, you do that is true. It's a nice man. But what I'll say is that we need to create a kind of space which is willing to talk about the issues we talk about, but just rejects the frankly batshit conspiratorial ideas which have become so prevalent.
Yeah, but the thing there is this whole thing you say it's tied up with the globalist thing. It's just, again, it's this misconception that it's the Jews or the Zionists who are behind the globalist conspiracy.
Yeah, sure.
Whereas in fact they're no more. If you want to look at organisations like the WF or Club of Rome, a Trilateral Commission through the ages, these weren't dominated by Jews or Zionists. There were a few, there are of course a small number of Jews amongst those, but the idea that somehow there are a lot of people in the so-called freedom movement who actually genuinely believe that all of those people are Jews.
Yeah, well, there are imaginary Jews, and the problem is that
because there are some really bad people out there in the globalists, we know that, and one of whom is a Jew in name only, which is George Soros, and of course the irony is that we get called, or people get called anti-Semitic simply for criticising George Soros, but he has no affiliation to Judaism, and he hates the state of Israel. Indeed,
well, it's look,
but he's called he's synonymous with the Zionist global conspiracy.
Yeah, I mean it's absurd, right? And we need to talk about anti-Semitism for what it is. But we also need to talk about anti-Semitism in places where we thought, hang on, do you really believe this stuff?
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, there are plenty of reasonable people that reject this in the circles that you and I are part of. But there needs to be more of an effort to really address this, because unfortunately what we'll see is that if it isn't addressed, then the very legitimate issues of that we see with globalism and with the way in which this horrid path we are on. I mean, it's just like if we don't talk about those, then that cause itself will be ignored.
But again, going back to the numbers game, for every one of you or me who talks about these things and tries to present rational arguments for, for example, for the case for Israel and what happened on October 7th, there's 100, maybe 1,000 other voices parroting essentially Hamas propaganda on this, which leads from sheer volume of material. People who don't have let's say, some skin in the game as we do over this, simply see a volume, this incredible volume of material countering the tiny, relatively tiny number of voices which are putting Israel's case.
Yeah,
so you get a situation where now, as I said, they're just perfectly rational people and are now convinced that there are some who actually think that the whole thing, October 7th, was a complete psyop, or it was AI-generated images. They think that all of the actual... You've got all this. And this view is because there are, as I say, for every one of us, there are 100 out there telling them that this is the case.
Look, and that's why the only hope I have is in the alliances we form with others. Because Jews just don't have... We are vastly outnumbered. But if people realise what anti-Semitism actually means, right, and understand its place in as a kind of crisis of civilization, and understand that its implications go well beyond Jews, and it consumes societies, it destroys societies, then I hope that people will join us in calling this out and and calling for not just a kind of paradigm shift in the way we're talking, but action. It's like governments, not only do they refuse to give it a name, but of course they just don't deal with it. They do not deal with the issues at play. And what's interesting is that they will call out, even now, when the police, for example, when that nutter went onto the streets and spoke about creating jihad on the streets, for instance, right? And the police would somehow justify it by saying there are multiple meanings to the word jihad. Yeah. We all know what clearly that guy meant. He wasn't talking about...
It wasn't just one guy. It wasn't just one guy. We're talking about hundreds of people.
We're gathering. Yeah. And I mean, the police think he was sort of talking about a profound, introspective struggle, right? It's like,
the internal struggle.
But you see, that is how the state has... This is how we've arrived at, as I said at the beginning, state-enabled anti-Semitism, because the state will... And even state-complicit anti-Semitism, they have kind of justified it.
Yep.
And
well, this is
that,
of course
that allows for violence.
The highly politicised Met Police, but I think
it goes beyond that. We look, the police across Western Europe and the state service across Western Europe do not have a grip on this issue, and the point that needs to be made is that whilst it's only a few that will go out and commit visible criminal acts, the problem of Islamist thinking has become so normalised in large sections of our Muslim communities, meaning that the underlying issues haven't been addressed, and the consequence of not dealing with those underlying ideological issues means that it's obvious that hundreds of thousands of people are going to flood the streets every week. Well, I mean, it's the inevitable. Yeah. It's an inevitable development from an issue that has just been ignored.
Okay, so how do you see this ending, even just in the short term with this current conflict?
I hope people will grow bored of these demonstrations. I think we're in a storm at the moment, and hopefully, with all I hope to God that the hostages are returned as soon as possible, and that Hamas are got rid of, and that we can have a swift...
Well, okay, well, that's a good positive point to end on, but the final thing about the book and its publication, can you just then tell us about that? About the actual publication. What's happening when people are going to be able to see it?
Hopefully very soon. I'm in the process of speaking to several publishers, but I'll say that we are in a storm at the moment, and things will calm down, but they will inevitably flare up again. And my book, I hope, goes some way to telling you, the reader, and wider society about why this issue matters and the consequences of not dealing with it.
Yeah, and of course it also, as you've indicated, gives some suggestions of how we can actually...
Well, I care about policy.
How we can actually improve the situation.
Well, improve we must.
Okay, so finally, where can people find you, basically?
OnlyFans. No.
I signed up.
Instagram's my preference, but Twitter, Harry Saul Markham, name for Twitter or Instagram, Harry Saul Markham, and find me, and just drop me a message if you have any questions, and I'll be happy to speak.
Thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.